Our third section on the age of imperialism is going to deal with India. As we said previously, the Suez Canal is the lifeline of British colonial interests in India India. That we cannot stress enough just how important the British felt the Suez Canal was, and with its completion in the mid 1800s, really changes the entire relationship between how Britain views India and what it does. Now, at the conclusion of the Seven Years' War, you probably know it from your U.S. history studies, is the part of the U.S. Engagement of the French and Indian War, and that's just one small section where it really can be considered a world war between Britain and France for kind of global domination. With Britain winning that war, it was able to gain complete control of India and pushed out France, really the last major other Western European nation from the subcontinent. Now, India itself, as we touched on very briefly when we talked about India in first semester, is very divided. One, it is a land of many different tongues. There's over a dozen different languages on the Indian subcontinent and over 200 different dialects of those dozen languages. Just like how we can watch in America a TV show of like the Swamp People in down in Louisiana and they need subtitles about that, even though they're both speaking English. We the same thing is needed in like all through India for different languages, and somebody from one part of the country listening to another somebody from speaking the same language might be a completely different dialect. They might need a translator, right, for that. This is a land of religious differences. India had the Hindu religion come out of that, right? But it also has strong portions of it that are Muslim controlled and ties there. Plus, there's other different religions of Sikhs and Jains and a small amount of Buddhists as well. So it's very religiously divided on top of it being linguistically divided. We talked how socially divided India was with the caste system that is very rigid, pretty much impossible to move between. That's a kind of an outgrowth of the Hindu kind of nirvana system. And so that goes and creates a social system that really keeps everybody in their place within India. It is also a politically disunified subcontinent. There were only 600, there were over 600 states at different points in different times ruled over by the Indian Raja or king, and the political disunity was just on top of another thing of the linguistics and other stuff. So it's already a land that's easily divided upon, which allows after 1763 for the British East India Company to show up there. And what they're doing is they're going up there and really taking over the Indian trade, particularly in tea, moving tea from India and other places west along with other different spices and stuff. And following as we move from the taking it over in the mid 1700s into the 1800s, India really becomes Britain's most valuable colony. And that's what again makes the Suez so important is because just how valuable Britain viewed India in terms of all its other colonial possessions. The quote that comes with this, just to show you, is that India becomes the jewel in the British crown. It's the crown jewel of British colonial interests in the world, and Britain really wants to be able to try to go and hold on to that for himself. So this is again on the right here. This is just a small, simple uh, linguistic map of just the different languages that they speak in India. And there's also, again, different subdialects from there. On the left, we have the different political divisions of India in 1798. And as you can see, the British are controlling small amounts of territory kind of on the borders, and the Indian themselves are controlling, again, a whole bunch of different states that they're dealing with that way. The term that we can kind of can you want to use with talking about the British view of the Indian themselves, again, is that term we talked about of paternalism, where, as you can see on the left here, the cartoon of the stereotypical British kind of uh, merchant middle class person, right, viewing the local native Indian as, again, as a child. Right? And so, again, somebody without shoes, right, dirty, right, knives, the idea of barbarism coming there, and again, bringing good old fashioned British cultural values, right, to kind of use that and bring those people up from there. And the picture on the right, you can see literally a British soldier riding on the back, a British merchantman riding on the back of the Indians themselves. And so this is the kind of ideas that Britain's bringing over to India. So we're going to watch a short little cartoon that kind of highlights the British colonial system here in India.
Bubble. In most cases, Europeans ruled their colonies with the help of, and sometimes completely through, intermediaries and collaborators. For example, in the 1890s in India, there were fewer than 1,000 British administrators supposedly ruling over 300 million Indians. The vast majority of British troops at any given time in India, more than two-thirds, were in fact Indians under the command of British officers. Because of their small numbers relative to local populations, most European colonizers resorted to indirect rule, relying on the governments that were already there but exerting control over their leaders. Frederick Lugard, who was Britain's head honcho in Nigeria for a time, called this rule through and by the natives. This worked particularly well with British administrators, who were primarily middle-class men but had aristocratic pretensions and were often pleased to associate with the highest echelons of Indian or African society. Now, this isn't to say that indigenous rulers were simply puppets. Often they retained real power. This was certainly true in India, where more than a third of the territory was ruled by Indian princes. The French protectorates of Morocco and Tunisia were ruled by Arab monarchs, and the French also ruled through native kings in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. For the most part, Europeans could almost always rely on their superior military technology to coerce local rulers into doing what the Europeans wanted, and they could replace native officials with Europeans if they had to, but in general, they preferred to rule indirectly. It was easier and cheaper, also less.
So let's get a good job of just re-explaining again what the relationship is between India. Things are going pretty well in India between with the dual rule between the Raja and the British government until the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857. The main cause of the Sepoy Rebellion is, again, probably a better way of explaining it, a more correct way, is a bunch of different causes. But again, the biggest thing is the grease bullet. The British only have a very small amount of people who are actually British in India. There's hundreds of millions of Indians who are there being controlled by the British. And they have their own kind of there. The British, in order to be able to rule that territory, needed an army. It's very expensive and costly to bring British people to there, so they employed local native Indians. Well, that's going fine until we start having the British cultural issues with India, political issues, economic, and the Indians, the people of India, begin to become upset and begin there. The tipping point is in 1857, a controversy over the grease bullet. With the introduction of a new Enfield rifle, the instead of just taking your gun and putting down just a ball and shooting it out, there's a whole package, and we'll show you a picture and explain a little bit better that were down there in order to help that package slide and be ramrodded down the barrel of the gun. Right? It needed some grease. What the Indian people begin to be heard, and again, it's not really a matter of truth or whatever, it's a matter of what people believe. They believe that the grease the British were using was either cow grease or from pigs. Well, if you remember, the two major religions in India are the Hindus who hold cows sacred, so they wouldn't want to put cow grease in their mouths, and Muslims who feel they shouldn't, for religious reasons, eat pork, so they wouldn't want to put pork grease in their mouths. So this becomes again the British showing their cultural insensitivity to the native people, and that leads to a rebellion that breaks out throughout the entire country and really causes the British to really reevaluate one, how what their actual relationship between the native Indians and Britain is, and to be able to go and crush this. Because the British East India Company is in charge of India while this is happening, and the financial houses back in London are being hurt by this, the government in London decides that they're going to take the East India Company, dissolve it, get rid of it, and take direct control over India. And they do that through the role of the British Viceroy, the British governor. He acts as the royal representative, right, for the British there, and he pretty much takes control over India for the British from there. And that's how India is pretty much going to go for the next 90 years or so. We begin seeing Indians clamoring for independence after helping Great Britain in World War One, and this leads into the Indian National Congress of the 1920s and 1930s, which is a nationalistic movement within India itself, claiming for Indian independence. This eventually is going to be led by Mahatma Gandhi, who leads this independence movement, and he does this through civil disobedience. Like, for example, his famous March to the Sea to disobey British salt laws and salt taxes, and he moves to try to end British rule, which will eventually happen following World War II. We then see how the political and religious and other divisions are going to be where we have later in the 20th century, where India, which again is mostly Hindu, has a territory that it's been kind of controlled with India under Britain. Pakistan, which is mostly Muslim population, break away, and this is kind of showed in the beginning of the movie Slumdog Millionaire, right? If you want to see that. So this is what starts the Sepoy Rebellion is the introduction of the Enfield rifle, and as it begins to move through the ranks, by loading the barrel of the gun, right, with the case with the powder, right, and then greasing down there. So you had to bite off the top of it to be able to pour the gunpowder down, ram the paper and all that stuff on there. But the key thing is putting in the mouth. Well, how to get this down faster? Well, you grease it. In order to be able to do that, right, the British needed grease. They're not going to put oil or industrial grease on. They need something that at least not going to cause people to be upset with, or upset their stomachs. So they used cow or pig grease, and again that upset either the Hindus with cows or the Muslims with pigs, and that set off a major rebellion. And so you can see throughout all of 1857, you have all these different things from there. And this becomes a major turning point in British control of India. The British people in India will bring up the kind of bill is called the rebellion. And it really comes a major sticking point kind of in British history in this particular region as they have to quell this uprising. As you can see, it's pretty much throughout all of the colonial things from there. Stories that come out of that include the what might be fake or the black hole of Calcutta, where sepoys working with the British army had gathered up and jammed into a very tiny, small um, uh, brigade in a small British fort of all the British people in the area, and it was like 120 people. And again, the numbers get all wishy-washy, and again, it might not have even happened, but because you have all those people in a very small place overnight, and it's hot and it's humid in India, only a few people survive the exhaustion and all the problems that come out of there. And so that's one of the good stories there. How did the British put this down? As you can probably imagine, pretty brutally from there. You can see these are suspected, in this painting, suspected uh, soldiers. And again, they're being hooked up to the business end of a cannon, and you can imagine what's going to happen when they go and set this off. So this is how the British are kind of reestablishing their rule in the nation. And again, as we can see over a period of about 100 years, we see the area under British rule take over more and more effect throughout the 1800s, and really accelerating after the period of rebellion. Briefly, as we move into the 20th century, Mahatma Gandhi leads India for its independence. Again, on the right is his famous March to the Sea to go and against the British salt tax that they had put on the native Indians. That's a pretty famous thing. Again, people in the American civil rights movement, particularly Martin Luther King Jr., are going to really take the ideas of what Gandhi does, trying to win freedom for the people of India and apply that to their own situations in the United States. Uh, Briefly, to move away from India, we're going to talk about the movement of people out of Europe. From 1815 to 1932, you can describe this as one of the great human migrations in world history, where over 60 million people are going to try to get the heck out of there. And the question we want to ask, well, why? Why are they trying to go and leave Europe? Well, as we talked about in the previous chapter, the agricultural revolution that precedes the industrial revolution leads to a population expansion. All the new agricultural techniques that they're doing leads to the population expanding. And so, what are you going to do with all these extra people? Well, you can move them to the cities of Europe to go and try to find industrial jobs, but people don't like those types of jobs. And so, again, you're kind of skimming off the top and sending them around to the rest of the world. People, right, have going back again to this idea of the Romans in Western Europe have the idea of kind of what do people want? They want their own land. They want to be able to farm it and do whatever they want for that. And so that's really what people are going. There's not a whole heck of a lot of land in Europe, or in England in 1815 or in the early mid 1800s. Well, where's their land? Kansas. Where's their land? Nebraska. Where's their land? South Africa. Where's their land? Australia. And so they want to go and try to find their own little farm out for themselves, whether they're Swedish and move into Minnesota, or they're German and move into Milwaukee or to the plains of Illinois. They're going out there, and then again, obviously for economic reasons. Job opportunities are limited in Europe, and they're being paid less, and so they can try to find other places not only around the world, but particularly in the United States. Who's moving? It's mostly rural craftsmen and farmers. You think about, we talked about this prior in previous chapters, that fathers are giving only their oldest sons the lands that they have. So any sons that come after that are given nada, zilch, nil, nothing. And so those farmers, if they want their own land, again, Iowa's giving it away some places for free. You can go grab it from Oklahoma. You can go all the way to Sydney if you want. And so they're moving up from there. And then rural craftsmen who are, again, trying to make their own ways from this. Now, the key thing to understand is that, again, particularly poor people in Europe who are moving out of trying to escape the steel mills and mines of, like, say, the Alps or Germany. What are they going to find for jobs in the United States? Well, the steel mills of Pittsburgh and other industrial places like in Chicago, and those still aren't great jobs. So most of these people are going to take some time in their early 20s, move to the United States for 2, 3 years, right? Work as hard as they can, work their tails off, and are not maimed, killed, or horribly stuff going on. Move back, buy their own piece of land or own part from there. The only exceptions to this mostly are the Jews, and we see a major increase in anti-Semitism throughout Europe through over the course as it builds through the 1800s. And so with the Jews, they're going to move the heck out of Europe to try to escape that persecution and mostly settle in New York City, to be honest, right? And then throughout the rest of the United States, but everybody else is going to be there, particularly as more and more people are moving out of Europe and ships get bigger and faster, and the price of a ticket begins to fall down. You get almost these birds of passage, is what they're referred to. People moving to the United States for 6 months, working as hard as they can, going back to Europe, and then doing that 3 or 4 times to be able to build up the opportunity for themselves. And so a lot of people moving all around the world. It's going to set up a whole lot of stuff from there. And again, you can see it not only just in Western Europe, but you see Chinese, Japanese immigrants. Again, England becomes one of the great kind of multicultural centers of the world where you have all the people of the British Empire moving there in small amounts, and then going from there and really giving it a different kind of culture than what you see around the world. People are moving all around. And again, these are big, huge, giant numbers, and particularly moving to the United States. And then again, you can see it really hammer off, close down with World War I, and you'll see it pick back up after the end of World War II.